proud to have this event. We're very happy to have you here. First, I would ask if you are a major of any sort in the School of Journalism and New Media, please stand up. Well, in large degree, this is what our democracy depends on, these people. Now, if you are a journalist or a journalism faculty or staff member, please stand up. Yeah. Retired too. That includes you, Tim. And these are the guys that are and have been on the front lines of our democracy because it depends on it. So there are a few people I'd like to thank before we start. First of all, Dean Hickerson and her staff, thank you for the faculty and the students that I mentioned. We'd also certainly like to thank the Jordan family. We have Gene and Jerry and Jenner Jordan here, so thank you for all that you've done to create this. I'd also like to make sure that you stay for the reception afterwards, which will be right outside here. Free food, cash bar, but that's sponsored by the Tupelo law firm of Hillen, Wicker, and Tapscott. And Reed Hillen is here with his wife, Mary Jane. Wave at him. So thank you for the reception. And that reception is to honor our speaker today, but also to honor our Mississippi Public Broadcasting. And we're happy to have them here. So I saw Royal Ailes, where are you? The Royal Ailes and Angela Perez, thank you. Mississippi Public Broadcasting needs our support more than ever, so support it. All right, amen. Can I get an amen on that? All right, and so to our press in Washington, D.C. and around the world, thank you for attending. To our friends at Com Daily, TR Daily, and all the other ones, we appreciate you do it. You can send in questions via Zoom. All right, so the way that this is going to work is our speaker is going to come and speak for a few minutes. Then Steve Herman is going to sit down and have kind of a fireside chat. You're going to send in your questions via card. We're not really taking questions verbally from the audience, so write it down, make it legible, and Steve will try to get through as many of as we possibly can. Since I'm doing it in kind of reverse order, let me tell you about Steve. We're really lucky. Oh, there's I didn't see the dean at first. Hey, Dean Hickerson, thank you. So Steve is our executive director of the Jordan Center. By the way, we do pronounce it Jordan. Jordan Center for Journalism, Advocacy, and Innovation. He's also an assistant professor of practice here at the School of Journalism. He's a former White House bureau chief and chief national correspondent of the Voice of America, and he spent 25 years in broadcast journalism in Asia. He's currently on the board of governors for the National Press Club and Jurist News at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He has appeared on BBC, CBC, CBS Evening News, C-SPAN, you name it, he's appeared on it, 60 Minutes, and he was inducted into the Nevada Broadcasters Hall of Fame in 23. I'm going to go ahead and ask you to applaud for him now, but he's not going to speak until later. But Steve, thank you so much. So this is a point of personal privilege for me because I've known Anna Gomez for about 16 years. She was sworn in 2023 as Commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission. She's done a tremendous job in telecommunications over the course of her some 30 years. She's a brilliant lawyer. She got her undergraduate. She's a Nittany Lion undergraduate. She got her JD from Georgetown. I'm sorry, George Washington. Ooh, I messed that up. Sorry, George Washington, GW. And she has worked in various roles. Now, I knew her when I was at the FCC, and she was deputy administrator of a little-known agency called the National Telecommunications and Information Agency, NTIA. She did tremendous work there. This is when they were doing the digital transformation of television that freed up so much spectrum that we got to be able to do so. She also got to work on spectrum, broadband spectrum for our first responders, police, fire, emergency, stuff like that, so that they can have dedicated broadband spectrum. These are major things that she's been able to accomplish in her career. And she's done so much else, I can't cover it all. She's worked on the Hill. She's been a legal advisor, senior legal advisor to a former chairman. She was born in Orlando. She spent some grown-up time in Bogota, Colombia, before moving to relocating to New Jersey. We are very fortunate to have her here at this time when so many of these issues are at the forefront. So would you please, give her a show us Mississippi hospitality and an Ole Miss welcome, Commissioner Anna Gomez.
Thank you, Admiral Burnett. Oh, I thought that was feedback. It was only been 16 years, huh? It feels it feels a couple decades. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to speak today. If you're waiting to come sit down, I see lots of seats. So please have a seat. I have so enjoyed, I got here last night, I leave tomorrow morning, but I have had a chance to walk around and to really get to see at least some of the campus. It's just beautiful here. Thank you for bringing this wonderful weather. I've really enjoyed also meeting with the students and the student journalists that I've had a chance to talk to, as well as the professional ones. And I'm so glad to see all of you stand up because you are so important to our democracy. It is journalists that report without fear or favor that hold power to account, and we need you. So please keep doing what you're doing. So, as the Admiral said, I'm Anna Gomez, and I'm currently the sole Democratic commissioner at the Federal Communications Commission, and one of the few remaining minority voices at independent regulatory agencies. As you know, earlier this year, I launched a First Amendment tour to fight back against this administration's campaign of censorship and control. I did that after my own agency launched a series of investigations in retaliation and targeted at newsrooms' editorial decisions meant to silence government critics, demand favorable coverage of this administration, and impose ideological conformity at independent newsrooms. Across 17 stops in DC, California, Florida, Illinois, Kentucky, Maryland, Washington State, and New York, I've been focused on shining a light on the ways in which the FCC's actions have been threatening freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The First Amendment has protected our fundamental right to speak freely and to hold power to account since 1791. It is foundational to our democracy. And today, I am here to tell you that foundation is trembling after constant attacks from our own government. Here are just some of the most egregious examples. This administration has initiated investigations and floated debilitating schemes targeting national broadcast networks for their newsrooms' editorial decisions, harassed private companies for their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, and threatened tech companies that respond to consumer demands for content moderation and fact-checking. They have attempted to shutter the Voice of America and sought retribution against lawful residents and to peacefully protest administration policies. They're banning books and erasing history from the public record and from our national museums. They are targeting law firms, unions, and those that have the skills and the will to stand up for the victims of this campaign of censorship and control. They are punishing private citizens who share opposing views online by contacting employers and threatening government intervention. They are going after comedians like Jimmy Kimmel, who use humor and satire to shine a light on government abuse of power. And of course, I cannot leave out the fact that they have been firing presidentially appointed, Senate-confirmed minority commissioners of multi-member independent agencies. This administration seems intent on using its vast power to punish anyone who dares to speak up and disagree with its agenda. Broadcasters across the country are facing an impossible choice: comply with this administration's demands or risk a financially debilitating investigation and the threat of license revocation. The power to revoke a broadcast license is being weaponized to punish stations that dare to report news in a way that this administration doesn't like. We have also seen this FCC use frivolous news distortion complaints and the power to derail corporate mergers to pressure news entities to abandon their editorial independence and to scrap their diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. The best example of this is the approval of the Paramount Skydance merger. After a baseless lawsuit challenged CBS's use of standard editorial judgment in a 60 Minutes interview with then Vice President Kamala Harris, Paramount cowardly capitulated to this administration by opting for a payout instead of fighting the case in court, a case they would have won both on the facts and the law. The company also agreed to never before seen forms of government control over newsroom decisions and editorial judgment. A government-sanctioned truth arbiter is now in place to field complaints about CBS's content and editorial decisions, which not only incentivize CBS to self-censor to ensure that journalists at CBS do not criticize this administration or express views that are against their agenda. The Paramount payout and capitulation in exchange for the transaction's approval have emboldened those who believe the government can and should abuse its power to extract financial and ideological concessions, demand favored treatment, and secure positive media coverage. That should alarm anyone who understands how foundational the First Amendment is to our democracy. Sadly, that did not mark the end of this administration's affront to democratic principles. Just recently, we saw one of the most alarming attacks on the First Amendment in recent memory. First, an ABC reporter was told that his coverage amounted to hate speech and that he should be prosecuted simply for doing his job. Then the FCC threatened to go after this same network, seizing on a late-night comedian's comments as a pretext to punish speech it disliked. That led to a shameful show of cowardly corporate capitulation by Disney that put the foundation of the First Amendment in danger. This was no simple business decision. It was an act of clear government intimidation. It is in moments like these when it is important to understand that the FCC does not have the authority, the ability, or the constitutional right to police lawful content or to punish broadcasters for speech the government dislikes. And if it were to take the unprecedented step of trying to revoke a broadcast license, all of which are held by local stations rather than national networks, it would run headlong into the First Amendment and fail in court. But even the threat of revoking a license is no small matter. It poses an existential risk to a broadcaster, which cannot exist without its license. Ultimately, after days of partisan pushback against this weaponization of government power, Disney backed off. However, for several days, the corporate behemoths who own large swaths of local stations across the country did not. That's because the billion-dollar media companies have business before the FCC. They are beholden to this administration as they seek regulatory approval of their transactions, and they are pushing to reduce regulatory guardrails so they can grow even bigger. That has left local stations trapped in the middle as these massive companies impose their will and their values upon local communities. This precise example neatly encapsulates the danger in allowing vast and unfettered media consolidation. With a vote just this week during our monthly meeting, the FCC is gearing up to make major changes that will drastically alter the national media landscape and the number of voices that are a part of it. Separately, the FCC is also considering overriding congressionally established ownership caps that for decades have played a critical role in preserving the agency's pillars of media policy: localism, competition, and diversity of viewpoints. Congress placed limits on broadcast ownership precisely so that one entity would not control the majority of the content that we all consume. That's the essence of viewpoint diversity. Today, that principle is at risk. Efforts to dismantle ownership caps and to allow greater consolidation are advancing. Each merger or acquisition reduces the number of voices that may be heard. Each closure of a local newsroom makes our discourse narrower and our communities weaker. The FCC's proposal to lift these ownership caps isn't about innovation or competition. It's about consolidation of viewpoints solely for financial gain. Billion-dollar companies do not need our help competing with national networks. This will do nothing to help the small, independent, and local broadcast stations that are at risk of closing shop. The FCC has a duty to ensure our media system serves the public, not billion-dollar companies. Not to mention, this form of media consolidation will further push independent local newsrooms to answer to corporate masters who are already under political pressure from this administration. The FCC won't need to threaten to investigate individual stations. Journalists and comedians won't need to be censored directly. They'll censor themselves to avoid conflict with regulators or risk losing government favor. The result will be a chilling effect on coverage, fewer jobs, and less diversity of viewpoints. We will also likely see further efforts to dismantle barriers to entry for media that is seen as favorable to this administration. Whether that includes the consolidation effort I just discussed, imposing new rules on virtual cable providers, or steering the next wave of broadcasting technology in their favor. In the end, this effort has never been about preserving a diversity of voices. It's about narrowing them. Take, for example, the successful campaign to defund public broadcasters. After months of baseless attacks, public media is facing an existential threat as government punishes them for alleged media bias, a term which in practice appears to encompass anything or anyone who disagrees with this administration. So while one set of outlets is defunded, stripped of licenses, or publicly admonished, others are quietly promoted and cleared of regulatory obstacles. The goal is not to reduce bias or to ensure balance, but to engineer a media environment that echoes the government's worldview. That is not viewpoint diversity, it is viewpoint control. And if we allow the government to decide which voices survive and which are silenced, we lose the very foundation of a free press, and with it, the democratic principles it seeks to protect. So as I wrap up, let me share one final thought. The duty to defend the First Amendment does not rest just with government, but with all of us. When corporations surrender in the face of government pressure, they endanger not just themselves, but the right to free expression for everyone in this country. That's why I've repeatedly asked companies, journalists, elected leaders, and citizens alike to stand up and to speak out. Now is the time for everyone to find their courage. We must continue to call out corporate capitulation for what it is, a betrayal, not just of journalistic independence, but of the public trust. Free speech is key to the future of our democracy, and we must push back against any attempt to constrain it. Thank you. Oh, we have one, okay. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Commissioner, thank you for being here today. You covered a lot of ground there. And there are some folks who may say that what you're expressing is a partisan viewpoint on free speech, the First Amendment, the Federal Communications Commission. You are now the only Democrat on the FCC. Some folks would say, we voted for the president. He selected his chairman. That chairman should be able to run the FCC. I suspect you disagree with that viewpoint. Explain, what is the real role of the Federal Communications Commission, and tell us some history about its bipartisanship traditionally.
Yes. So the Federal Communications Commission is an independent, expert-driven body, multi-member body. We were created by Congress. Actually, originally it was the Federal Radio Commission, and it was the predecessor to the FCC. And when Congress created the predecessor to the FCC, it considered putting the obligations of the FCC in the executive branch under the Department of Commerce. But at the time, it thought, and it was right, that it was too dangerous to put such an important communications medium, which at the time was, of course, radio, under the control of one person who would be subject to the whims of the president. It was too important to the First Amendment. So it created an independent agency, and it was a multi-member agency. When it created the Federal Communications Commission in 1934, which was the next body to regulate media and control the airwaves, it also made it a multi-member agency. Originally, it was a 7-member agency. It whittled it down to 5. Now we're 3 just because we have 2 vacancies. And no, I don't know why I still have a job. I know you're thinking that. Why? Why is it so important to have an independent agency regulating the most important communications medium of our time still? And it is because we are supposed to be regulating in the public interest. We take an oath when we are sworn into office to uphold the Constitution. And that means upholding the First Amendment. You asked me originally what the FCC's job is. We have multiple jobs. We license spectrum. The reason we regulate broadcasters is because we license the airwaves that they use, and they get them for free, and we ask that they serve their communities with those broadcast licenses. We regulate very lightly when it comes to content. We only have 3 goals when we regulate content. Protecting children. So we have regulations regarding what kind of advertisements you can show during children programming hours. Informing the public. So we have regulations about, for example, when you see a political advertisement and they always end with, oh God, I can't remember what the exact words are. You know, this is my message and I approve it or whatever. We want them to inform the public. So we want the public to be informed. And I forget what the 3rd reason why we regulate, but it's very light. But we really, and the reason we don't regulate content otherwise is because of the First Amendment, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press. Congress thought it was so important that we ensure that we honor the freedom of speech. They added another section of the Communications Act, which authorizes us, that specifically prohibits us from censoring broadcasters. So remaining independent is important because we don't want what we are seeing today, which is this president hating the media to the point where he constantly denigrates them and demands that their licenses be revoked, and then watching the FCC take action to punish that media. That is, I can't think of something more dangerous to our First Amendment and our freedom to speech.
You mentioned that the FCC issues these broadcast station licenses and that the licensees are supposed to operate in the, I believe the phrase is public interest or necessity. My understanding is that means that they must be responsive to the needs and problems of their local communities. How do you police that? And where do you draw the line? Some people say FCC shouldn't be policing at all. And others, of course, I think the chairman takes he would be a pretty tough cop on this beat if he had his way.
Yes. So one of the things that's happening today is that what you see this administration saying is that anytime a broadcaster says or does or reports on something they don't like, they are violating their public interest obligations. The problem is the FCC has not defined what the public interest means. Traditionally, when we regulate in the public interest, we have 3 goals. One is localism, serving your communities. The second is competition. Competition's good. We love competition. It benefits consumers. It leads to innovation. And the third is ensuring a diversity of viewpoints so that people are not subjected to just one point of view. That is just propaganda at that point. Those are traditionally the pillars of our public interest, our regulations in the public interest. So because of the fact that every time a broadcaster says or does something, they get accused of violating their public interest obligations, I have called for the commission to initiate a rulemaking to define what it means by the public interest. Because otherwise, we're just regulating against what we don't like. And that is a direct violation of the First Amendment.
If we were to take a survey, probably in this room or in Lafayette County or Mississippi, we might find that most people are probably not viewing television content or audio over the airwaves, meaning terrestrial TV channels, which are licensed by the FCCs. They're watching via cable, satellite TV, online streaming, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, so all the social media apps. The FCC does not really regulate those areas. Yes, there's some licensing of satellite frequencies and things like that. Has this new technology and the trends of the audiences now in the United States making the FCC irrelevant?
Yeah, you're right. We don't regulate content on cable, for example. We regulate some technology issues, and we regulate how they negotiate with over-the-air broadcasters to carry their content. And Congress hasn't changed the statute for decades. So the last amendment of the statute was before the internet really became a big thing. And there's those who say we should start regulating, for example, streamers. But that's more from a business perspective.
How do you feel about that?
I think competition is good. I think that we need to adapt to changing technologies. I don't think the FCC should engage in censorship ever. Thank you. Thank you. However, not about censorship. I do think that we need to take into consideration the market changing. Local broadcasters are under a lot of stress right now because it's very difficult to compete for advertising dollars against national streamers. However, if you are watching local broadcasters on your streamer, that local broadcaster is still producing content that's important to you. And the thing that I fear, so let me finish my thought. So I do think that we need to look at how much we control that consolidation, the rules against consolidation on a market by market basis, because we have to acknowledge that these some broadcast stations are suffering from difficult economic times. Decades ago, they were rich and happy. They controlled all the advertising dollars. Everybody wanted to go there, but they're really facing a lot of competition.
FCC licenses were called a license to mint money.
To mint money, yes. And the two things that make them money now are the retransmission consent payments they get from cable, from streamers, which means, I pay you so I can carry your content, and advertising. And they're losing those advertising dollars. So we have made a decision as this country that we have free over-the-air market-based broadcasting. And why is that important? If you listen to your radio during times of crises for news, that is a FCC licensed radio station that is giving you your news. It is telling you where to go in a hurricane, or where there's a tornado, or wildfires. Local broadcasters serve their communities, and I really hate the thought of losing that, because what we lose when we lose these sources of news and information for our local communities is we lose the literacy and civic engagement of the listeners and viewers and readers, now that we're losing newspapers as well. if all they see is nationalized information, news and information. The other thing that we lose, and I don't think people really think about this a lot, but if you consume your news through a social media site, it is either questionable from a journalistic perspective, whether that news is accurate and fact-based, or it is based on the good journalism by those local broadcasters and print journalists that is then retransmitted through social media. So it is really important that we find ways to bolster that news and information. And we haven't talked about public media. I'm sure you plan to talk about it. But Congress defunding public media is a severe issue for this very problem. We have a local broadcasting system that is struggling financially and wants to consolidate. And the more it consolidates, as I said in my remarks, the more we lose those viewpoints. While at the same time, we are defunding public media, which is in every local community providing that news information that is so vital to those communities. We are going to lose that diversity of viewpoints as well. It is not good for us to be fat and happy and ignorant of what's happening in our local governments, our local communities. And that is what I worry about with all of this consolidation.
You mentioned you had a public meeting this week.
Yes.
Lifting the cap, ownership caps are sort of complicated, but basically you're looking at allowing more groups to own more stations. One argument is, of course, I think most people are in favor of local diversity, independent ownership, mom and pop, still a lot of mom and pop type radio stations, not TV stations necessarily. But a lot of these stations, small stations, are struggling. And why not let the groups acquire them rather than have those owners turn in their licenses?
Yeah, what we did on Tuesday, we are required by statute, it's called the quadrennial review. So it's,
Sounds fancy.
Right, it is. Where we look at local ownership limits for television and radio. There's a separate cap that's a national ownership cap that is set by Congress by statute. And that national ownership cap limits the ability to own stations that reach more than 39% of the households in the country. So with regard to the quadrennial review notice of proposed rulemaking, we are looking at limits, for example, that would allow the 4 major networks to own more than one station in the same market, or ownership also of radio stations in the same market. It's more consolidation that way. Again, like I said, I'm trying to balance keeping that diversity of viewpoints while at the same time understanding that we need to help these broadcasters survive in this new environment that they find themselves. So I would be comfortable with considering a market by market analysis, because there's some markets that still get plenty of advertising dollars. They are not going to go out of business. And then there's some where unfortunately they will. While at the same time, I really think that Congress needs to reconsider their elimination of funding for public broadcasting, because I really want to make sure that we keep that local reporting and that local information that communities need.
By the way, if you haven't turned in your cards yet, please do. But there's one name that keeps coming up, Commissioner, on a lot of these cards. It's not Donald Trump, by the way. It's Jimmy Kimmel. There's been speculation about the motivation of Nexstar and Sinclair for temporarily deciding not to air the Jimmy Kimmel show, even after ABC, which is owned by Disney, brought it back after a brief hiatus. What's your interpretation of what's going on there?
These corporate behemoths, as I call them, they are the national networks of a large number of local stations throughout the country, have business before this administration. So they are trying to curry favor with this administration. And this administration has made it very clear they don't like Jimmy Kimmel. They don't like any of the late night comedians because they are using satire to push back against this government. Satire is a very strong tradition of pushing back against those in power that everyone in power hates. But they have a First Amendment right to make jokes. And so when ABC suspended Jimmy Kimmel, it did so immediately after the blowback from folks that were offended by what Jimmy Kimmel said in his show. Then the two corporate owners, as you know, I'm probably telling you everything you already know, they said, well, not only do we think that he should be preempted or suspended, they called for even further measures to halt the speech and to, again, retaliate against the broadcasters and that show in particular. But these two national owners of these local broadcast stations, they have transactions that they want to get granted by this administration. And we have seen that this administration uses the fact that it has to approve mergers and acquisitions in order to impose ideological requirements on the companies or censor these companies. I mentioned in my remarks the Paramount Skydance deal and the voluntary commitment by Paramount to install a truth arbiter, which they called an ombudsman, in order to field complaints about bias and any content that CBS has that people don't like. That's self-censorship. And to make it a part of a transaction, so our approval of the merger, they voluntarily committed to do that. And then the FCC said, well, we will confirm but verify, and we will take action against them if they don't follow through on their commitment. That's censorship. So they see this, these corporate owners see this, and they know they need to curry favor with this administration so they can get their transactions. They also want the lifting of these ownership caps because they want to get even bigger. And so, again, they have a reason why they want to curry favor with this administration. And finally, they want the help of the FCC to transition to a new broadcasting technology, which they hope is going to make them a ton of money and lead to more data-driven advertising. So when you know you have this business and you see that the administration forces companies to voluntarily commit to take actions against diversity, equity, and inclusion, to impose an ombudsman, to basically lord over the news organization to make sure that they are making editorial decisions that are not going to tick off this administration, you are going to continue to try to curry favor by doing things like insisting on preempting Jimmy Kimmel. In the end, the pushback worked by consumers, by the creators, by the artists. And that started actually affecting their bottom lines and Disney's bottom line, which is why Jimmy Kimmel is back in the air. And that is why pushback is so important. One voice may not be very loud, but a collection of voices is very powerful.
A couple related questions to that coming in online and on the cards here. I'll combine these. Question online. FCC Chairman Carr criticized Kimmel's monologue nearly 2 full days after it aired. Did the FCC receive any public complaints on Tuesday, 1 day after the monologue aired, but 1 day before Carr's comments? And should Carr step down for attacking Kimmel by saying, quote, We can do this the easy way or the hard way.
I'm not touching that one.
Yeah.
You know, it's a good question. I need to ask that question about complaints. I don't know,
Okay.
but I do know that after ABC suspended him, we got thousands and thousands and thousands of complaints about the suspension.
Okay.
I got emails, I got letters. People are actually pulling out a piece of paper, writing on a piece of paper, putting it in an envelope and stamping it on this issue.
This is sort of a regional question, and I'll let you have a stab at it. Will Nexstar be approved to buy Memphis's ABC affiliate, now owned by Tegna Group?
So this is one of the transactions that is not before the FCC yet, but Nexstar is the largest owner of local broadcast stations in the country. It is at 39% of the national cap. If it buys Tegna, it will be at 80%. My view, it's not before us, but my view, as I mentioned, this 39% cap is in the statute. It is not a rule that we can waive. I think Congress would have to lift that in order for us to be able to approve it.
Okay. What do you think of the description of certain broadcasters as too woke and the war on woke? What does it mean, and what should we expect from broadcasters in the public understanding of history and social issues?
So, if you think it's woke, that's a viewpoint, and it should not be censored. So, broadcasters are private companies. And when I say private, I don't mean that they're not publicly owned as in shares. I'm saying non-governmental companies. If they want to have programming that is conservative, that is their right. Now, some people will say, well, it's news distortion if it has a bias. That could not be more wrong. We do have a news distortion policy at the FCC, and you'll hear this a lot. Well, they violated the news distortion policy because they got this wrong. That is an incidental getting something wrong. Can you imagine if you have to be 100% right every time you report on a news story? Facts come in, right? Journalistic practices and ethics are important. And it's important that broadcasters serve their local communities by giving them good information. But just because you think it's a bias doesn't mean it violates the news distortion rule. The news distortion rule requires intentional distortion of the news, and it has to be of a matter of significant importance. So for example, if for some reason the broadcasters decided to say that I was wearing red shoes, that would not meet the news distortion standard, number one. Number two, it's the local broadcaster that has to intentionally distort the news about a matter or a matter of significant importance. And it's very difficult to prove that unless you can find, transcriptions of messages that say, we are going to lie about this in order to make money or take action against somebody, or because we think it's just going to make us more money if we lie about it. So I think it's very important that even if you think the content is woke, then go find another station that you think is less woke. That is the answer. The answer to speech you don't like is more speech. And you have the choice to decide what it is that you want to see or hear, but we don't have the right to retaliate against it.
These next two questions are sort of related. Would you ever consider allowing public media to receive retransmission fees since they have been defunded effectively? And what strategies, if any, have been proposed to increase advertising dollars for struggling localized news media outlets?
I have to admit, I didn't know public media can't get retransmission fees.
That's the question. I
Yeah,
can't verify that that's a fact.
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we're going to defund public media, then we need to help them find sources of funding because they're so important. It might require legislation. I don't know. I just don't know the answer to that specific issue. And I forgot the second question.
Innovations in advertising
Oh.
for struggling local stations.
Well, I'm not sure there's much the FCC can do in that regard. But I think we are seeing the media landscape evolving technologically where they're trying to find ways. And you're seeing that with newspapers too. We don't regulate newspapers. I know I talk about them a lot, but local journalism really matters to me. And I'm hopeful, very hopeful that in fact that they will find ways to survive what's happening right now because it's that important.
We hope so. You mentioned the quadrennial review, and that triggered somebody.
Uh-oh.
Why does the FCC consistently miss its deadline to publish the quadrennial review?
I don't know.
We really put you on the spot. All right, here's another, not a softball. Do you believe that the president will nominate new individuals to fill the vacancies at the FCC, and when will that occur?
Yeah, so the way that the FCC vacancies are filled is the president nominates commissioners and the Senate confirms them. I haven't seen any movement, but as you can imagine, as a Democrat, the White House doesn't talk to me about these things.
Shocking.
So I don't know the answer to the second one, which is when is it going to happen? One thing I do know is under our statute, you cannot have more than 3 members of the same party.
Right.
And so right now, that would be 3 Republicans. We have 2 Republicans right now and 1 Democrat. You don't have to have all Democrats after the 3 are filled. But I haven't seen this president nominate anyone that's not a Republican to any position, even if it's supposed to be a minority position like mine, anywhere in this administration. So I would be really surprised if that happened.
Can the president fire you?
He thinks so. So the president has been firing Democrats throughout the federal government. We mentioned the importance of us being an independent agency. We're not the only one. The Federal Trade Commission is also an independent agency, and he fired the 2 Democrats on the Federal Trade Commission earlier this year. He has fired the Democrats at the Consumer Product Safety Commission, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the I'm losing track. He's fired Democrats throughout
Well,
the
and there's also
administration.
been entire independent boards that have been.
The Civil Liberties and Privacy Oversight Board, all fired. So the Federal Trade Commission in particular is important because there's Supreme Court precedent that holds that the president cannot fire specifically the Supreme Court precedent is about the FTC. An FTC commissioner, the Federal Trade Commission commissioner, without cause. And cause would be, oh gosh, malfeasance and other bad stuff. So that precedence, I think, dates back to like I can't remember, the early 1900s. But it's before this Supreme Court now in Slaughter v. Trump. Rebecca Slaughter was one of the Democratic commissioners that got fired, and the lower court found that it was inappropriate to fire her under the Supreme Court precedent. And it's this poor woman. The lower court finds she can't be fired. She goes back to work for like a day. The Trump administration goes back to court and gets the decision stayed. She's been back to work 3 times, and the Supreme Court finally stayed her going back to work because it is going to take up this precedent, and it's made very clear it's going to overturn the precedent. So under current Supreme Court precedent, I cannot be fired except for cause. And that's how it's been interpreted. Although even the Communications Act does not have a for-cause clause. So I have an even weaker case than the Federal Trade Commission, which has a for-cause clause. But I expect that the Supreme Court will reverse that. And at that point, the independent commissions will all be subject to the whims of this president.
You may have heard that a country music radio station refused to play Beyonce's Cowboy Carter album. Some believe it was because of her race and views on diversity in the country music genre. Would the FCC have any role or purview if the station's decision was challenged? I guess the people can send in complaints to the FCC about anything that they hear or don't hear on TV or on the radio, right?
Yeah, they can, unless it was a violation of an existing FCC rule, which I can't think of what it would be. We can't force speech either. That is also a violation of the First Amendment. I may not agree with it, but I don't think that's something that the commission can take action against.
Okay. Here's a question from online. If the FCC did hold a proceeding defining the public interest standard, what would you want that definition to look like? You probably could write a book almost about that, but briefly.
I'll tell you what I would not want it to look like. It would not be, you cannot report the news the way that the FCC doesn't like it or the administration doesn't like it.
Okay. Someone has what they refer to as a personal question for you. What led you to telecom law and the FCC?
Oh, thank you for that question. So I went to George Washington University, as the Admiral said, and I took communications classes in law school. And I had this one professor, and I had a 9 p.m. class. Can you imagine? That was crazy. This professor was a practicing telecom attorney. So he worked at a law firm all day, and he would come in, and he was so excited to talk about telecom law. Actually, and he would wave his arms around and really just was so interested. And the class was really interesting. Communications is really interesting to me. It gets more interesting every day because of technology advancing and the fact that we are so affected by it in every possible way. But anyway, sorry, I digress. So I would sit in the back of that class and I would just think to myself, I want to do whatever that guy's doing. Because he worked all day serving his clients at a law firm, and then he would go in and just be so passionate about it. So when I applied to law firms in DC, I went to school in DC, I applied to firms that had communications practices, and I got hired at one of them, and I was very lucky for that. And they put me on cigarette litigation. And so I did that for 3 years-ish. And this is a complete coincidence, and it just tells you manifest things. One of the partners in a different part of the law firm with whom I'd never worked was Al Gore's counsel during the first Clinton-Gore election. And she ended up over at the FCC as the deputy chief of the Cable Services Bureau.
Wow.
She called me up and she said, hey, do you want to come work here? She had gotten to know me because I used to run the Hispanic law students mentoring program for the Hispanic Bar Association of DC, and she used to come to my events. And I actually thought about it and I said, well, is this timely? 3 years is not very long. And I talked to people about it and they said, are you crazy? You should do it. So I went to the FCC in 1994. And never looked back. I've done communications since.
We have a couple of questions. I suspect there's some law professors and law students in the room. It's quite a hike over here from the law school now, which used to be in Farley Hall attached to this building. Do you see a challenge to New York Times versus Sullivan and in Congress or by Trump? It's actually speculated that this will end up before the Supreme Court at some point. We probably don't have too much time to explain what that is if you don't know that, but it is a key case talking about basically you can sue somebody just because they got the color of your shoes wrong. You have to prove a willful disregard for the truth and malicious intent, et cetera, et cetera.
I certainly think that this administration is going to push the boundaries as much as it can in order to bring press to heel. I am deeply hopeful that the Supreme Court will not reverse this precedent. Your original question asked one thing, and I do want to say this. One of the things that I've been heartened by with all of this whole Jimmy Kimmel thing and my First Amendment tour is the bipartisan support for pushing back against this administration's violation of the First Amendment. It is a traditional conservative platform to protect freedom of speech. And there are a lot of very alarmed people out there. Now, why? Because they fear it will come back to haunt them later. But because it is bipartisan pushback, that is part of what gets the government to stand up and see. And I'm just really hoping that our courts uphold the precedent in New York Times versus Sullivan.
Couple of questions. These are rather technical, but
Oh, God.
about the transition to ATSC 3.0, which I guess is next gen TV.
Yes.
And questions about whether broadcasters should be compensated or a rebate program. Any quick thoughts on that?
So the transition to ATSC 3 or next gen TV is something that the broadcasters, well, some broadcasters, I got to say, it's not uniform, really want to do. I've heard it also called broadcast internet. So it's using the airwaves more in an IP format so that you can use part of the capacity for the broadcast transmission, but then you can also use it for data casting and for advertising, for getting information about what people are viewing, for pushing out updates. You know, it's really sort of entering this new technology age. The last time we went through a major technology transition of the broadcasters was what Admiral Burnett was talking about with the digital television transition. And if any of you may remember, the government paid for people to get coupons to buy themselves converter boxes, because the transition from analog to digital meant people's old TVs, because kids, that was a thing. If they had antennas, you know, the rabbit ears, were not going to be able to work if they were not already digital. And the government considered it important to transition to digital because it meant we could use we could consolidate the broadcasters in less spectrum, and then we could auction the rest of it and make tons of money and do good things and create innovations that lead to all the wonderful products that you have that are electronic. So the question is, should we have another coupon program or some kind of a voucher to pay for this next transition? And let me tell you why that question arises. Is because, once again, if you have old TVs, they're not going to work to get this. You're going to have some kind of a converter to be able to get this new broadcast medium. Cable companies are going to need to buy equipment. Consumers may have to buy new TVs, and that is part of what's holding up this transition. It's not going to be cheap. I haven't seen Congress particularly motivated to do another coupon program to help with that transition. And so it's really a difficult thing of trying to balance helping these broadcasters, again, try to compete in the digital age versus imposing costs on consumers and others.
I think this may have to be the last question.
Okay.
What role should the FCC play in the emerging technologies like 5G, AI tech, satellite internet, so that people, consumers, especially in rural areas, are not left behind?
there's a few components to that. First, it's your inputs, right? The FCC is very important for managing the airwaves that lead to satellites, 5G. All of those rely on spectrum in order to get their services. And so we need to continue to work on that. It's actually a multinational effort, particularly with satellites, because satellites are boundaryless. But it requires the FCC to be constantly looking at ways to free up more spectrum or to share it, to establish the technical rules around that. Getting affordable service is another important part of what we do. We have a program called the Universal Service Fund, and that helps us fund service providers in high-cost areas, particularly rural areas, and also to provide funds for affordability for consumers to get service. I don't think those funds are sufficient. I have very much advocated for Congress to change the program so that we can actually have a higher benefit so that consumers can afford broadband, because it's such an important part of our daily lives. And there are proposals in Congress to do just that. So I'm hopeful that that will move forward.
Okay. I'm going to hand you over all the cards here with all the questions that we did not
Thank
get to.
you.
And the commissioner has promised to personally send you all an email. You will have an opportunity to get in some of those questions. We have a reception with some refreshments, and what else? You can pay for some alcoholic beverages too, right?
Alcoholic beverages. I saw Tom Wicker come in, so he'll and ready to Tom Wicker was the editor of the Daily Mississippian back in the day, and we thank Hill and Wicker and Capcom for that. And once again, thank you all for coming.
And thank you, everybody online.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Nice job.